Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Immersion Talks. We're continuing our conversation with Mushtaq Ali Al-Ansari, specifically around the Moro arts. And as he learned it, these are the arts from Mindanao. Moro arts is something that is much more a newer term that has been thrown around to distinguish it from traditional FMA, if you will. But what we're really talking about is the arts from Mindanao. So I had, if you've heard the previous recordings, I was trying to track down Mushtaq, and because I was reading a lot of his writings on, I think it was called The Traceless Warrior, and true to his name, that has disappeared from the internet. So, from that we met, and then we started working on things. I told him my interest was the Kampilan, and that's what we're hoping to start talking about today. So Ada, welcome aboard and welcome on this rainy day. And I know you guys are also dealing with water, and let's just say we have a shitstorm on my end, but it's a good break to get away from that nonsense for a while.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's an amazingly bad flood.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, talking of bad floods, I think it it's very tropical right now. That's how it feels. Lots of rain.
Yeah.
Trees falling down, whatnot. So what better setting to talk about Mindanao and one of their most famous weapons, the Kampilan. It's a weapon that is shrouded in so much myth, if you will. So much. There's so many stories around it, whether you look at it from Lapu Lapu to statues and a lot of the Datus holding these weapons. So it's a big weapon, but yet you hardly see anyone practicing and training it. You see a few videos here and there. And I think people are trying to get creative with it. A few perhaps know a few things, but a lot of them are trying to apply traditional FMA principles to the Kampilan, which I believe the logic is quite different. So Atta, why don't we start with what on earth is the Kampilan and why should I care?
Yeah, we should preface this with, I am not an expert on the Kampilan. I only know a little bit. If you want experts on the Kampilan, you would have to go to Mindanao or talk with somebody who has actually trained their whole life in it. So a Kampilan it's sort of the equivalent to the European broadsword or longsword. It's huge compared to every other Filipino weapon I know of. I've seen them with blades almost 4 feet long. And they are different. They're very different shape. We have one of our training Kampulans here. It would be hard to see because my recording space is not too roomy. So this is the handle, which is the most distinct thing. And this is the handle up. It would be held like this. And it's very unusual. Sometimes it will have hair coming down here, that sort of thing. On some of them, there will be bells along the bottom here. And then the tip, the point, is distinctly wider than at the grip. And kind of unusual and forked. This is obviously a cutting sword. There's your name on it. And the crossguard is usually made of wood, and it's thick. And it often has a sort of, it's not a wire, but steel or bronze or brass fitting that comes across like a big staple or a series of them, a wave that will be on either the outside or both sides, which act as hand protectors. And so I think of it in the way I think of the the arming sword evolving into the side sword with a complex hilt. This blade was evolving into something with a complex hilt.
So how many cutting edges does it have for the uninitiated or for the ones who have never held one?
Well, it has a single cutting edge along the length of its blade, and then oftentimes the tip is sharp on all of its edges, or at least part of its edges. It's not heavy. People think that it's going to be a heavy sword, but you know, the heaviest Compulon I have ever handled weighed less than 3 pounds. So this is not like a heavy sword, and it's meant to be able to be used one-handed, because a serious body of Compulon technique is Compulon and shield. And which would make sense. I mean, if you're going to go into battle, you want as much protection as you can have. And so training one-handed with the shield was a big thing when I was learning this. The shields that we used were made out of plywood and were either round or rectangular in shape, depending on the techniques we were using, and they were either strapped to the arm or center grip. The long, thin, rectangular ones were center grip, and the round ones were strapped to your arm.
So one interesting thing, Atta, I mean, I would love to hear your thoughts more on it, because it kind of always stood out for me, is the two tips, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the geometry of it is so amazing. It goes straight into your eyes, guys. And
yeah, and it can entangle, which is interesting. It can actually even trap, which is sort of incidental, but it's there. And it can definitely thrust. It will do damage on the thrust, but that's not its main thing. Its main thing is to cut, and not to chop like an axe, but to cut. If you understand the difference, and you do.
Yeah, and that thing can move pretty darn fast. So
yeah,
it
especially
looks...
because of the shape of the handle. You have all of these leverage points that people don't realize you can use. I mean, when you started, you tried to hold it like a katana.
Yes, I remember.
Yeah. But being able to use your offhand as an extra lever. I don't know if I can show this from here, but this hand can move with the blade and apply pressure in different ways to accelerate the sword, to change its trajectory very, very quickly. And the handle is also really good for trapping, which is something that I don't think is as known as it should be.
So how did you go about learning this? I mean, so you know, how does one? I mean, I've been working with you for a few years, but however, if somebody new is coming up, or if you were going to start teaching this to someone new, how do you go about teaching them the logic of the Compulon, so to speak?
It would start with, how does the Compulon move? How does it want to move? And not in a numbering system. Like I said, what I learned had no numbering system, but in its arcs. How does it move that way? How can you defend with it? What the footwork has to be to keep you safe from both your opponent's blade and your blade, because with a blade that long, one mistake and you're like short a kneecap.
Yep, it's very hard to recover, especially if you swing too wide.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's all of those things, and then it's a matter of you have to feel it. And so in the way that we've trained, I will present to you problems. You know, here you have somebody who is going to attack you with this weapon this way. And then we look at the logical sequence of moves to get you safe, and then reply, or how can you attack somebody first? We haven't done that as much, but that's an important part of the art. Not just being defensive and waiting to reply to an attack, but creating an opening and attacking first, and attacking successfully.
So, those are two pieces. Now, what about footwork, and how does one start practicing this footwork? I mean, I know the old man would always tell you move like this, and then you started giving
Yeah.
it some language so that you didn't have to do that same
One
stuff
of
with
the
me.
things that he did to help our footwork is he would take a long stick, like 6 feet, 7 foot long, and make us defend above the waist with a blade, and below the waist with our footwork. And if we got it wrong, we got whacked on the leg, which is makes you learn quickly.
Yeah. So what are some of the generic footwork patterns that one should expect when learning this?
They tend to be basically geometric. So a line, a triangle, a square, a circle, a cross, which is pretty standard for South Philippines and Indonesia for footwork. How to step along those. And it's mostly footwork strategies. So how do you move if you don't have any room, for instance, and you still need your footwork, because you can't just stand there and take an attack. So how do you move in a small space? How do you move if you have lots of room? All of these things. And the only way to learn this is by doing it. So as you know, when you and I are working, I will present you with an attack that uses a particular footwork pattern that forces you to respond to it in a logical way.
Yes, and I must say, I mean, I'm pretty good at tracking things, but still with this art, I think it's so intuitive that if somebody were to pin me down and ask me, okay, what exactly is this? I would not be able to verbalize it. I probably will say, hey, feed me and I'll show you. But I don't think I don't think I can at least put words
Well,
around it.
it's the problem, and part of the problem is that this art doesn't have a particular language to describe itself, because it was always learned pretty much one-on-one or one-on-two, and you can say, do it like this, because you can demonstrate it. It doesn't need fancy names. So I've adapted my descriptions from Western historical fencing, because it works well. It covers all the same things. So, as you know, I will talk about measure and time and, the right angle and all of this, because my background is in Spanish school. And it helps to have a descriptive language, but this art didn't come with one, because it didn't need it. You only need descriptive names like Fair Lady Work Shuttle or whatever for large groups of people who are reading manuscripts and need something to work as a mnemonic, as opposed to having somebody right there who says, no, do it this way. You know, drop your shoulder, do whatever.
So I would love to have you talk a little about the 4 planes of movement, because moving along those 4 planes of movement, especially the infinity patterns, is it's quite beautiful with the Kampilan, and covers, at least in my view, covers a 360-degree angle in terms of how you can move and protect yourself.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, when I talk about that these days, I think of the in engineering, especially in aviation, you have these 6 planes of movement.
6
6.
planes. Okay.
Yeah, so you have forward, backward,
Yes.
side, side,
Up
up,
and down.
down, and
Yeah.
then you have the 3, you know, twisting this way, yawing, pitching, all of that sort of thing. So it works out to 6. And in a 3-dimensional space, those are the only ones you can have.
And the
What
first
I
one being
learned,
time, which is basically covering distance.
yeah.
Hmm.
And time in this sense is more like Aristotelian time, Aristotelian physics, as opposed to modern
Wonderful.
physics, where time is movement over distance. Yes. And you know, this is not the language of how I learned it, but it's the language by which I have made sense of it. When I look at a particular, you know, the simple crosscut like this, that's a horizontal infinity if you pull it out, and it doesn't just work on a flat plane, it bends around your body.
Yes.
Because it naturally has to. And so you would have that, you would have the vertical. You can make an infinity this way. And then you have front and back. You can make an infinity that starts back here and moves up here and then moves back, higher, low, and they go in both directions. And that gave me a coordinate system for describing what I'm doing.
So again, guys, it's really hard to try and put a language around this.
Yeah.
So moving from there, can you share more about the coordinate system? And
not without getting up and showing you, and I don't have the room to do that here.
yeah. Okay. So what about somebody just listening to it? You know, the general questions I generally get asked, I'm going to pass it on to you, is how many strikes do you have? How many blocks do you have?
1 strike, no blocks.
So the follow-on question from everybody will be, what do you mean no blocks?
A block is where you put something out to stop something else from getting into you. It's banging something against something. We want to avoid that at all times if we can. I mean, it is better to block something than to die. But rather than blocking, I use the word parry. You know, again, from fencing, or to displace, or void. All of these words from fencing are closer to what we do than blocking anything. You know, you think of Shotokan karate, right? You got this, and you're imagining you're smashing into something coming into you. And then consider Tai Chi, where you are just deflecting it very, very lightly without having to clash into it. And it's sort of like that. So we don't block. We ideally, we attack in such a way that our attack avoids our opponent's attack. And we move our body out of the way.
Get the heck out and kill the guy.
Yeah.
That's the summary.
Though we don't kill anybody anymore. That's old days. We just have fun.
Yes, yes. So if back in the day, how long did it take for, say, an apprentice to get good with this, because it's not like they had leisure time like we do. We generally do this for leisure. It's highly unlikely that you or I will walk around with a Kampilan down the streets,
Very, very unlikely.
Correct.
One would hope anyway. Maybe in the zombie apocalypse, we might get our
Yes.
Kampilans out.
Yeah, that'll probably be my weapon of choice there.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Atta.
But the best way to describe this. Ask your next question. I think I lost my thought.
All right. So, what about, were there other pairs of weapons that were used along with the Kampilan, or it was just Kampilan and the shield?
Most people, I think, would also have a crease.
Hmm.
I'm not talking about like the light Indonesian keris, but I'm talking about a Filipino style crease, what they call the Moro crease, which is big, heavy bladed, can both cut and thrust, and is very common. And most people had a gunang, which is a small knife with a kind of almost pistol grip. But interestingly, the system that I learned did not do double weapons. It didn't do a spada idaga or anything like that. It was like one weapon and a shield, or one weapon and an empty hand as a rule. I didn't start picking up double weapon stuff, Sinawali and that sort of thing, until much, much later.
Okay. So I would love to hear if you have any teaching stories around the Kampilan, or why it was used, or how they used it back in the day. I mean, you've shared quite a few with me, but I don't want to presume and jump ahead. I don't know what you were sharing with a larger group.
I mean, it was definitely a major weapon. It wasn't a weapon for everybody, because it requires a certain amount of skill. As I understand it, in the old days, the most common weapon was the spear. Spears are easy to make, relatively speaking. They require much less sophistication in their metallurgy. And they give you a lot of reach. If I was going up against a Kampilan, the spear would be my first choice.
I would agree with you. I would want to get in the way of the chopping machine.
No, I would want to be as far back from that as I could be.
So then, going into the spear, how did the folks from northern Mindanao use the spear, and what's the logic system there, especially when it comes to dealing with the Kampilan?
The logic system is stay back and fast thrusts to poorly guarded areas, and a lot of luck. And you have to be able to use your spear one-handed. I mean, we see a lot of people doing two-handed spear, which is great, and that was part of the system. But one-handed with a shield was the way to go, because you're better off with the shield most of the time.
Yes.
And it's not to say that you can't use the spear two-handed, because obviously you can, and lots of cultures did. But you can't beat that extra amount of protection.
So what about the training with the spear? How does that generally progress? I mean, what do they do?
In some ways, the spear is the easiest weapon to learn. We haven't really begun to address that yet, but we will soon. And it progresses the same way as everything else. Here's your spear. Here's how you use it. Here's how you grip it. Here's how you use it with two hands. Here's how you use it with one hand. With one hand, you can use it underhand or overhand, right? You can go down with the spear or you can come up with the spear. And why would you do that? Why would you choose one over the other?
You have to get around the other person's shield.
Yeah. Or if you are working with other people. If I have 4 friends on either side of me, and we all have shields and we all have spears, we're going to be overhand. We're going to be coming down over our shields. If I am alone dueling with somebody, spear against spear, spear against compulon, whatever, I'm probably going to be underhand because I can still flip it up for overhand shots, but I have more options on the other hand, underhand.
Yep, makes sense. Makes sense. So what about the shields? How were the shields made? What were they made of? And how light, heavy, sturdy were they?
The shields were made of a lot of different materials depending on where you were and who you were. The round shields were often woven, which I find interesting. And you find that in a lot of different places, from the Ottoman Turks all the way to China. These shields woven from light materials, held together in different ways, that can take a cut. And shields are designed to be used and thrown away, basically, easy to replace. So if they get chopped up some in a battle, no big deal, as long as you don't get chopped up. And they're surprisingly hard to cut. So for the round shields, most of what I have seen is woven. Sometimes they will have metal plates worked into them, make it harder to get through the shield. For the rectangular shields, I have seen those examples of those mostly in museums, everything from solid metal, which would be heavy, to various different kinds of woods. The solid metal ones were a bit smaller, very beautiful, and I often wonder if they weren't just for elite guards and stuff at the Sultan's courts. But I've seen examples of them, and depending on where you are, they can either be lighter or heavier, and they also will likely not survive a battle. They'll have to be replaced at the end of a battle because they will have been significantly chopped up. But easier to replace a shield than your neck.
Yeah. So then what about the last 2 weapons, the Keris and the Gunong? What would you share about those?
The Gunong is kind of a holdout weapon. It wasn't, it was, this is all I got, so this is what I fight with. And that, it's also a utility knife. The Keris,
everyday carry of the day, so to speak.
Yeah, if you ain't got nothing else, you got to at least have your Gunong. Though most people, I think, back in the day had their Kreese at least. The Kreese everything that we use follows the same pattern and logic of moving using what the engineers call the 6 degrees of freedom, which is what I was describing. So I don't know that we had all of the degrees. I have to sit down and count sometime. But
Bucky mathematically lays out 12, but humanly, we only have 6 degrees
yeah,
for Bucky. Yeah.
yep. Yeah, and he knew things.
He knew things, yes. Yeah.
And there is the one other weapon which we haven't mentioned, which is the
Panabas.
Panabas, yes,
Mhm.
which is less common. The Panabas can either be an agricultural tool or a dedicated fighting tool, or sometimes both. The Panabas that we used was, a lot of Panabas are curved kind of up like that and sharp here, and it's like really good for going and cutting cane and that sort of thing. The one that we use, as you know, looks a little bit more like
A massive kukri.
yeah, a massive kukri on a really long handle. And it's designed to deliver incredibly powerful cuts.
Yeah, I can't imagine using that as a field tool, you know. It's something
Yeah.
that feels like designed to chop heads.
Yeah, and that's kind of what it was for. That was a preferred executioner's tool. There was less emphasis on it, but again, everything uses the same pattern of movement, just adapted to that weapon.
Yeah, and the Panabas is quite deceptive, especially how the length of it can change right in
Yes.
the middle of the fight, and how it can go from under to over with a small flick.
Yeah, and how it can go from right hand to left hand to both
Left hand.
hands. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Though my sense
So,
was it was not the primary weapon of choice.
yeah, I mean, why would you use that when you have a Kampilan that can do so many other things, or
Yeah.
use a spear to keep the guys at bay, right?
Yeah, or even use a crease, which gives you a
Speed.
lot more options. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of the broad spectrum, if you will, of the weapons that you did, Ata. Anything that we missed out? Anything that else from Mindanao that you want to perhaps highlight?
Not really. I mean, that was pretty much it. We did a little bit with flexible weapons, which I think was based on the buffalo whip, but that was a very, very small part of it, and just a demonstration that everything works with these principles. That was my teacher's contention, is that if you understand the principles of this art, like most Filipino arts, you can pick up anything and use it.
So if you're ready, I want to go a little left field, Ata.
Okay.
So the little left field is the use of muskets and guns, and one of the reasons that Mindanao was not captured, right? Because, I mean, they withstood the Spaniards, and then they also withstood the Americans, and that's no small feat, given that two of the greatest empires or colonizers were kept at bay.
Yeah. Well, Mindanao had been trading with China since forever, since there were boats. And especially with the folks from the Tausugs from Sulu, you know, they're a great seafaring people, and they were trading all over the world. They traded to India, they traded to Southeast Asia, they traded to China. And one of the things they traded for was gunpowder and musket and cannon. So when the Spanish attacked the north, there was not a parity in weapons. Firearms were not as common. They were way more common in the south. And after the folks in the south figured what was going on, they really worked hard to make sure that they would get more firearms. I mean, I know the Spanish at times tried to run blockades of the island to keep them from zipping over to China and buying a bunch of muskets.
I think
dig up all of my material on this, and so I can cite historians and that sort of thing.
I think the other thing that most people may not appreciate is what an important role religion played in keeping them as one tribe or one people, right? Because that, care to share a little about that, Ata?
Yeah, well, Mindanao was predominantly Muslim. Not everybody, but a good chunk. And there are different tribes. They would have hassles with each other, but rather than the usual Spanish tactic of divide and conquer, Islam provided a common ground for the peoples of Mindanao to unite against an external enemy that was an existential threat to their way of life. And I think that played a bigger part than some people realize. And that went on up until, who was it, Perry, who just brought his ships offshore and started shelling Mindanao from the ocean, to the point where there was nothing they could do because they were so outgunned. But on the ground, the peoples of Mindanao were incredibly dangerous. I mean, that's the story of the Leatherneck, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And you had people who would, fight to death. And it made it very hard to hold the island.
Yeah. I mean, the term AMOC comes from them.
Yeah. And frankly, the grip of the Philippines government on the island to this day is not as substantial as they would like.
Right.
And that's based around religion, because it's the Catholics versus the Muslims. It's the same thing that we've seen in Europe. Only being an island in the middle of the Pacific, it was a little bit more difficult.
Right. Right. Well, any other closing thoughts, Ata, on this particular topic of the main weapons used here?
Not really. I mean, you have to experience them.
Yeah. And if I may just throw a little plug here.
Yes.
Guys, go ahead, Ata.
I was going to say, we need a plug at this point. So,
yeah. So what I would say is that, hey, you want to come experience this, come to the Holy Blood, Holy Blade, and we are looking at quite a few of those principles, and Ata is going to be showing that, and well, you can also see him beat me up 10,000 ways, so to speak. But that'll be one of the few places that you're actually going to be able to see this to an uninitiated crowd. And what I mean by an uninitiated crowd is, if you've heard the previous talks about the teacher and the student, the doors are closed, it's not easy to get in. So this might be one of your few ways for you to come and see it. And most importantly, in context, specifically as we discuss, like what the Spanish would have done and how the Moros dealt with the Spaniards.
Yeah, we haven't, the only time that I have done anything even remotely like that is when Moro was here for him, because it was for him.
Yeah. And that was a fun few days, intense few days that Mangromi and Timothy and a few others, Manoron, Saturno, and a few others got together and to do things. So this will be your chance, guys, and the best way to do is go up to www.theimmersionlabs.com and sign up, and hopefully we'll see you there. If nothing else, I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast and feel free to share. Thank you. Thank you, Atta.
My pleasure.
For some, it's the quest of an empire. For some, it's been the quest of power and riches. For some, the quest for honor. And yet for others, the quest for freedom. Blades and bladecraft have done just that. So Richard Burton has said, the history of the sword is the history of mankind. And that's the journey we are on. No blade culture has defined the world as much as the Spanish bladecraft. And yet, no art develops in a vacuum. It is shaped by those that it interacts and fights with, and also shapes the cultures whether they are conquered or manage to maintain their freedom. In this particular lab, we're going to look at how Spanish bladecraft influenced arts across the 5 continents. We've traversed 20,000 plus miles. Wharton teachers with over 700 years of combined bladecraft experience together in one place at one time, where over 3 days and 40 hours of non-stop training, you will be able to see and experience firsthand how it shaped Europe, how it shaped the bladecraft of Northern Africa, how it developed the arts, both indigenous and otherwise, in Philippines. Moving over to Latin America, from the jungles of Colombia and Panama, how the arts of machete developed. Coming further up north, looking at the arts of the southwest Mexicali region, where the long bullwhip was developed. Or looking at the development of a very American form of fighting, the Bowie bladecraft. The impact on the Asian martial arts itself, with the Chinese art being completely transformed by fencing and fencing footwork. Lastly but not the least, is looking at the biomechanics of what full contact bladecraft does, how it shapes your movement and what works and what doesn't work. This is the experiment we embark on. The lucky few who come here will get a view of 500 years of bladecraft that developed across 5 continents, and the relationship between the conquerors and the conquered, between the wannabe conquerors and the freedom fighters, between those who fought as pirates and those who fought to maintain their honor. This is that experiment. This is holy blood, holy blade. For more information,